Hey budding herbalists and gardeners, I'm Maria Noel Groves, author of Body into Balance and Grow Your Own Herbal Remedies and clinical herbalist at Wintergreen Botanicals. Today we're going to talk about some of my favorite reproductive herbs classically used for women, although they do have a variety of uses for all genders. And we're going to focus in now, starting off, on two really beautiful shade, part shade plants that are known to grow natively in different parts of the United States that are on the United Plant Savers to watch list. So not things that you would necessarily want to be wildcrafting or using wildcrafted plants that you find commercially, but things that would be really nice to grow in the garden that actually do grow relatively easily. So one that I use very often in my practice is this one right here, and this is black cohosh. It's a really beautiful plant and traditionally grows wild in places like Appalachia. You wouldn't necessarily see black cohosh growing wild here in New Hampshire, but it is very easy to cultivate here in the Northeast. And it really does it'll handle full sun, but it prefers a little bit of part shade. These are some baby plants that got replanted from the mother plant. And while the mother plant is doing pretty well, due to some logging, it's ended up in more of a full sun condition. And I've noticed that these baby plants that are a little bit more protective have grown really nicely and are doing really, really well. And this is an east-facing part of my yard. It gets shade from the house, and probably from about noon on, these plants are in full shade or indirect sun. We're going to use the roots of black cohosh, and they're a plant that do take some time to really have the opportunity to grow and use. It can take anywhere from 3 to 5 years for those roots to reach a good state to be harvesting, and then you're going to dig them up ideally in fall. You could also do spring, and you're really going to want a nice sharp shovel to dig in and pull those roots out of the ground, and you can replant some of the little eyes. So the roots will have little eyes on them. You can make medicine with as much root as you can, but if you have extras left over, you can replant them in other places of your garden pretty easily, just making sure that you have at least one eye on that root and placing it just under the ground. And that's what happened here. I dug up some herbs several years ago from my main garden, and I ended up having a lot more than I really needed to make my tincture. And so I planted a few babies into this garden here, and they're doing phenomenally well. I don't have the dates in front of me, but it's probably been about 5 years or more that they've been growing here. And as you can see, they've grown up to be quite large and beautiful. And they have these nice big flowering stalks. They have not started to flower just yet. They will soon. And they have these white, really funky looking flowers, and they kind of look a little bit like something out of Dr. Seuss, don't you think? And they have these tall white flower spikes, or racemes. This is Actaea racemosa, formerly called Cimicifuga racemosa. Racemosa is referring to the raceme shape of the flower, which is like a spike with little stems coming off that are attaching each one of those flowers. And the flowers actually don't smell that great. They kind of smell like mothballs, but they attract various insects that like unpleasant smelling things, and that's how they get pollinated. There are some other varieties that smell quite nice, but they probably don't have the same medicinal uses. So when you're going to figure out what black cohosh you're going to use to harvest, stick to the wild or true types. It used to be called Cimicifuga racemosa, but in the last few years or so, the well-meaning botanists and taxonomists have decided that it's actually within the baneberry group, which is one of its relatives, and so it got renamed Actaea racemosa. But a lot of the product manufacturers haven't caught up with the new names yet. It hasn't caught on yet in the rules around naming products, so you might still see it listed as Cimicifuga instead of Actaea if it's on a product label, or if you're looking at an older botanical source. Either way, same plant. Other Actaea species, however, are not used the same way, or at least not exactly the same way, and may be a little bit on the toxic side. So we're going to dig up the roots, ideally in fall, possibly in spring. You can use them fresh or dry, but I prefer to use them fresh because they have about twice the medicinal activity, or twice the potency, when they're fresh versus when they're dry. So I usually will make a tincture extract of them, but you could use them in other formats as well. And you can definitely use it dry. It's just not quite as strong. And before I had my own roots, I would go to places like Mountain Rose Herbs that had sources that I could really trust and use those as a dry plant tincture, and that still works too. But I would make sure that if you're sourcing black cohosh from someplace else, make sure that you can really trust where you're getting it from and go through some of the identity testing if you're able to on your own, because this is a plant that is commonly adulterated in the market, especially when we're looking at the international market. So what happens is that China will purchase North American black cohosh, because this is where it comes from, maybe not from New Hampshire, but it comes from North America traditionally, they'll purchase ours, cut it in with other Chinese species, and then sell them back into the American market as black cohosh. And some of those Chinese species do have liver toxic properties. So there have been a few case reports around the world of liver toxicity associated with black cohosh. Our true black cohosh is really unlikely to have a problem. It seems to be that it's due to adulteration. So really sourcing your plants accurately is very important. And there are ways to tell when you dig up the root, if you chop through it, it shouldn't have any like caverns and holes in the inside of it. Those could be signs of other cohosh species, but it's usually not a concern when you're growing your own, especially if you get it from a nursery that really specializes in native woodland medicinal plants. I wouldn't, as I mentioned before, go for the really specialty species here if you're planning on using it as medicine. Around here in New Hampshire, I get mine from Foundwell Farm, but there are definitely other sources out there as well. You can check in with United Plant Savers, and they probably have recommendations of a nursery near you. And if you aren't able to grow your own, you could perhaps purchase it from a certified organic farm. I find Mountain Rose convenient, but it's still an international market for the most part, and I know that they do really great quality and identity testing, so that's why I tend to go for them for some things. But had I known then, back when I used to buy it, what I know now, I probably would have gone to some place like Zach Woods Herb Farm or sought out some other United States direct from the farm grower, and I probably would have had even better quality source material that way because it's just coming directly from the farm and is much fresher that way. So we're going to dig up the roots, not right now, but later in the season. And what we're going to use it for are a couple different things. One, it's one of my favorite remedies for hot flashes. It doesn't have its activity right away. It usually takes several months for it to build in. Some people do notice an improvement almost immediately upon starting black cohosh, but usually it's something that takes time to build. And in some of the studies they've done where the studies were shorter, they did see that it really didn't work that much better than a placebo, but other studies where they've used extracts for longer periods of time have generally seen good results using it for symptoms like night sweats and hot flashes. It seems to not so much act like a phytoestrogen. It doesn't seem to have a phytoestrogenic effect on the body, although you will see that use listed in some sources and in some of the literature. But what it seems to do instead is have some effects on how our body deals with estrogen and communicates around estrogen, probably from a way that it's communicating from the brain to the ovaries and telling the body to produce that estrogen. And that's helpful when we're in our perimenopausal and menopausal time frame, because oftentimes the communication between the endocrine glands in the brain and the ovaries starts to get a little bit cranky as the brain is yelling down to the ovaries to say, hey, pick up the pace, make more estrogen. But the ovaries are like, we're really tired and we're getting old and there just aren't that many follicles left and we just can't do it the way that we should. And that disconnect can cause some surges of follicle stimulating hormone in the brain yelling down at the ovaries to pick up the pace, and that's actually what seems to cause those temperature fluctuations in perimenopause and menopause. And black cohosh seems to do a pretty nice job cooling that down, improving the way that things communicate so the body's less apt to go and yell down to the ovaries to tell it what to do. We can also use it in folks who are still in their more reproductive years, in particularly female-bodied folks in the reproductive years, for helping to support the uterus, support uterine health, and particularly act as an anti-inflammatory, anti-proliferative, antispasmodic. So it may actually be a bit useful for things like polycystic ovarian syndrome, for cysts, for endometriosis, for menstrual cramps. It's definitely not a cure-all. Some of those conditions are really quite complex and might require a much bigger approach than just one herb, but black cohosh is one of the herbs that we might consider for those conditions. And it also just has some general anti-inflammatory, anti-rheumatic effects throughout the body. So some people will use it for rheumatoid arthritis, especially when we're using the crude root, like we would dig it out of the ground and make medicine with it, as opposed to fancy extracts. We might use it for rheumatoid arthritis. We also can use it as a little bit of an uplifting herb, particularly classically used for dark cloud depression. So when people just feel really weighted down by depression and just feel like they're living under a dark cloud, and black cohosh might be useful there. And where I see it being particularly useful are for folks who have cycle-related depression and mood issues, and particularly those who don't tend to react well to Vitex. Vitex is another herb that I find challenging to grow in my cold zone, but that does grow, is able to be cultivated in other ecosystems of the United States. And oftentimes we use Vitex berries for helping with PMS and mood swings and all of that. But there are a few women who get really like moody and agitated and maybe even severely depressed on Vitex. And I've personally found in my practice that the clients who just don't seem to do that well with Vitex do better with black cohosh when it comes to supporting cycle and mood simultaneously. It's a complex plant, so it's definitely not all that there is to black cohosh, but that's primarily what I use it for. And I'd say that in the market, you mainly see it marketed for hot flashes, menopause, night sweats. And you can combine it with other herbs. So there have been some studies that have combined St. John's wort and black cohosh together to use for perimenopausal mood swings and depression, and found it to be effective in those particular studies. It has a very long history of use. It was definitely used by Native Americans. It was also really popular amongst the early settler doctors, the colonists who came in and learned about plants and sort of in a sense stole some of the plants from the Native Americans. It was popularly used by them. So you can find a lot of old literature referring to it, as well as modern science. It's definitely one of the best studied herbs for perimenopausal symptoms alongside soy, and it's generally got really good results for that. Most of the research is on a product called Remifemin that is a standardized extract. We are using the crude root, but that seems to work quite nicely as well. Something else of note when you're working with the root and you're making medicine with it, this is not necessarily a super high dose plant. It's not so much that it's dangerous in high doses, but it's not necessarily necessary to do high doses. So you could definitely use just maybe 10, 15, 20, maybe 30 drops of tincture, but this isn't one that I see you needing to take whole teaspoons of the tincture. I find that kind of handy when I'm working with a fresh plant that's already a little bit more concentrated and potent compared to the dry, because when I'm making formulas, I only need to use maybe 10 or 15% of a formula being black cohosh, and then I can add other herbs to that formula as well. So it's a really useful herb. It's a good one to know about. It's a good one to make sure that if you are buying it, that you're sourcing it appropriately. And it's good to know that if you are going to plant it in the garden, that it does pretty well in those part shade conditions with just a teeny bit of moisture. It doesn't really need to be watered, but it doesn't want to be super dry. But it does take a while before you get a harvest, so you're in the long game for this one. But fortunately, there are a handful of herb growers throughout the country that do grow it and sell it, so you can get it from them while you wait for your plants to grow. So that's black cohosh. Over here is a plant I just kind of want to mention. Even though I have not really used this medicinally, I haven't dug it up, I just haven't had the heart to, and I don't think it's that easy to dig up. But this is wild yam, which often you'll hear of being used in perimenopause as well. The roots are used of this plant, kind of like with the black cohosh. It's another native plant that's on the United Savers plant list that they encourage us not to be wildcrafting, but to be cultivating. And it does pretty well. It's not that hard to cultivate. It's another one that takes several years before you can dig it. And we're using the roots as a really great anti-spasmodic. It's not one that you often get to see, which is why I thought I'd give you a chance to see this plant while it's in growth, and it's starting to, the flowers have gone by right now. And we have these cute little seeds that are starting to form, but it's a vine with really pretty heart-shaped leaves. And we're usually going to be using the root not so much as a hormone balancing herb, but more as an antispasmodic. So I don't use it often, but when I do, I might use it when there are spasms and pain in the reproductive system, like menstrual cramps, or in other systems as well, like the digestive system, gallbladder, those kinds of things. Of course, you want to make sure that there's nothing serious going on that requires medical attention, but wild yam is an herb to consider. It's a little funky to tincture. Sometimes it gets a little bit clumpy, but you can still certainly use it in a tincture format. And if you are going to source it, again, you want to be cautious to source it from someplace that's not just organic, but specifically certified cultivated organic, because if it can be called organic but still be wild crafted. It's sort of a weird thing in our industry. So you want to make sure that somebody's actually farming it, cultivating it, and not just harvesting it from the wild, and that it's organic simultaneously. There are a few herb growers out there for that, and you can just ask around and look around. I do have various sources for herbs listed on my website that you can check out. It's a good plant to know about even though I don't personally use it that often in my practice because of the sustainability concerns, and it's not one that I have yet to really go in and harvest from my garden. It's also growing, right next to my house, so that was probably poor choice in planting on my part, because who knows, what chemicals might be right next to the house. So that's another reason why I personally haven't harvested this one, even though it's growing really quite beautifully. Something to know about wild yam is that it is sometimes referred to as a hormone balancing herb, which is probably a little bit of a misnomer. They used to use saponins from the roots of wild yam to manufacture various hormones, including some of the early birth control pills. But you really need multiple lab steps in order to turn the saponins that are in wild yam into estrogen or progesterone or other hormones. So it's not something you can take internally and your body is just going to use as estrogen or use as progesterone, but it is a really great antispasmodic. So when you really need that use and you can't get relief from other herbs that are a little bit more easily harvested and sustainably wildcrafted, like Cramp Bark and viburnum, or your black cohosh that's been cultivated, then you could try turning to something like your wild yam. So those are 2 herbs to know about. Really, really beautiful. Very glad to have these in my garden and really taking up, beautiful space here in the garden. Over here we have lady's mantle, and this is starting to go by right now, but it's really a beautiful plant to grow in the garden. Very popular in places like Ireland. Right now it's in the sun because it's at the end of the day, but this is a plant that's really appreciative of part shade, so I would usually grow it either on the east or the west side of the house so that it gets shade for about half the day, or it could even tolerate a little bit higher shade than that. And it doesn't like too much competition, so it likes to have some space where it can grow on its own. And it has beautiful silvery foliage throughout most of the year that will collect the dew, and there's a lot of lore around the dew collected from lady's mantle and it giving you, the love of your life or everlasting beauty, depending upon how you use that, if you drink it or you put it on your skin. And we're going to use it medicinally for women's health by using those aerial parts, the leaves and or flowers. So usually we harvest it a little bit earlier than this when it's in bloom, just starting to bloom, and still has really nice leaves as well. And we're going to dry it and make that into tea. And it's almost always used as tea because what we're using from lady's mantle are those gentle astringent properties that we get from the rose family that help tighten and tone the uterus, the reproductive organs in general, and probably also the digestive system as well. And it has a nice, pleasant flavor that's sort of akin to black tea or green tea, more like a green tea. And you could also use this as a substitute tea if you were looking for a green tea substitute that was not caffeinated but would give you a somewhat similar flavor profile. Lady's mantle works really nicely for that. It's not necessarily hormonal in the same way that phytoestrogen herbs would be. It's more that it's helping to gently tighten and tone those tissues of the reproductive system, and would also be equally safe for male, female, or really any gender, to help support them in less bogginess in those tissues. So we would especially think about lady's mantle if things are really leaky, or sometimes also if they're just feeling really boggy. If you're jumping up and down on the trampoline and it feels like your uterus is going clunk, 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 there might be other things you'd be looking into too, but those gentle rose family astringents would be really nice, including lady's mantle. It's a little bit more controversial in pregnancy, so I would be more apt to use something like raspberry leaf in that case. That is a little bit more broadly useful, and raspberry leaf is also going to have more nutrient profile to bring to your tea blends, but lady's mantle is a good consideration. You could play around with using it in other ways as well, but it's most classically used as a tea. And I would go around and just harvest, assuming this was a little bit happier. It's not bad. I could still use it in this stage, but ideally I would have preferred to harvest it a couple weeks ago. And I would just go through and harvest some of these with a pair of scissors. I don't happen to have scissors on me right now, but I grabbed some branches and dried those. I could also just grab whole leaves because we do have these beautiful fuzzy leaves, and they're just really, really nice to work with as medicine. I would make sure that they're relatively dry before you go ahead and harvest them, to dry them, because it's going to be much easier to dry plants that are already dry than ones that have moisture on them. And you also want to make sure that they're relatively clean because they do collect a little bit of dust, and it's just kind of a nice softness to this plant. It's interesting that they're in the rose family because they don't look like they're in the rose family flower-wise, and that's because it doesn't actually have petals. What we see that look like little petals are actually the calyxes, which on other plants that have petals would be oftentimes green parts that hold that flower in place, but this one just has those calyxes. And we still use it as medicine. We still call them flowers even though they don't have petals. That's okay. We don't want to make them feel bad about that. And you can go ahead and harvest this, dry this as you would dry any other herb. They dry pretty nicely, and then garble them once they are fully dry and use them as tea. So really fun thing to include in the garden, especially if you have that space, and it's a really beautiful herb in the garden, especially in the earlier season when everything's really silvery and covered in dew. So I'm standing here amongst a nice little hedgerow, if you will, of brambles, and this is commonly where they would grow. We have the lawn in front of me, you can't see that right now, and then we have the forest behind, and we have this nice little stretch of brambles that are taking up the space in between. And the main brambles that we have here, we have two different species. We have our wild raspberries and we also have our wild blackberries. And while they both can be used medicinally, both of them have astringent tightening and toning properties to their aerial parts as well as their roots. What I really want to focus in on are the wild raspberries. And wild raspberries are a really premier tonic. It particularly gets used for women and folks who are female-bodied. However, you can use it in any gender. There's nothing really overtly hormonal about it, but what raspberry leaf tends to do is go in and tighten and tone the uterine lining and that type of reproductive tissue quite nicely. And studies have even shown that it strengthens the muscles of the uterus so that it functions better, which might be partly why it works so well for ensuring a swift labor if consumed as a tea in the last few trimesters of pregnancy. But we can use raspberry leaf at pretty much any age in a woman or anybody's life, and it's really rich in nutrition. It's high in vitamin C, especially when it's fresh or freshly dried. It also will have calcium, magnesium, iron, and other minerals in it. And then it has those tightening and toning astringent properties as well. And it has a really high safety record. Really, of most of the herbs that we might consider to use in pregnancy, this is one of the herbs that has the highest reputation for safety and generally well accepted to be safe and acceptable. And so we're going to harvest the first year leaves. And so raspberries grow on perennial roots. So the roots are these little thin roots that are weaving their way through the soil, and then they put up canes in two different ages. So the first year they just put up leafy growth and they're really happy and green and vibrant, and that's the stage that we want to harvest for making tea or any other remedy, but mostly this is a tea plant. There are also the second year canes. So once that first year cane has persisted through the winter, the next season is when it's going to produce flowers, and then once those flowers get pollinated, those flowers will turn into berries or fruits. Technically, botanically speaking, they're not berries, they're something like an aggregate fruit, but we're herbalists, not botanists, and we're generalists here, so we're not worried about all those funky botanical terms. But we really don't want to focus so much on the leaves in those second year plants because all their energy is going to produce those flowers and fruits, and so they won't have as much energy left in those leaves for us to use as medicine. But of course we can enjoy the flowers as flower essence, and we can enjoy the berries, as nutritious berries, and those have totally different uses. The flowers of raspberries are used for forgiveness and helping to support us in that process. Blackberries, in contrast, are used for helping to manifest our reality when we're constantly dreaming about what we want to do but not actually doing it. Blackberry flower essence helps us manifest that and actually do what we're hoping to do. And the berries of both fruits are really rich in antioxidants of various types, and great for brain health, great for cardiovascular health, helpful in blood sugar balance, and so much more. But we're focusing today really on those raspberry leaves. And so let me show you a little bit about how you can tell those first year and the second year canes, because that's something a lot of people have questions about, especially when they're new to herbalism. And I have both of them here because usually you are going to have both in the same spot unless somebody cut back all the canes from the previous year. So here, I'll just pick it so that we can see it a little bit more closely. Here we have our typical first year canes. We're a little bit late in the season right now. Usually we're gonna harvest this in late spring, early summer. So it's still acceptable to harvest at this stage, but it might be even a little bit more vibrant. And while high in tannins, not quite as high in tannins if we'd harvested it maybe a couple weeks ago. And we see that the stems are light green. They're still kind of bendy and happy. There are really fine hairs along here, not like blackberries that like are just gonna grab you and pull you off the lawnmower as you're going by or as you're walking through the woods, rip across your pants and tear them to pieces. Raspberries are a lot more gentle in that way. And when you're looking at them, you're usually gonna notice that the leaves are, this is technically one leaf right here, and it's a leaf with multiple leaflets on it. So it's a divided leaf. Maybe you might even call it a compound leaf. And when you look at it, usually you'll find that there are 5 leaflets on a leaf. That will vary a little bit, but typically you're going to see 5, and they're going to be in a pinnate shape. So pinnate is when they grow kind of like a feather, where you have a line. Oftentimes there's one at the end, and you have them growing off multiple points as it goes down, versus palmate, which is what blackberry has, and that would be in the shape of a palm, where everything's coming out of one central spot. So the leaves are attaching at different points along that little leaflet stem here. And so you're going to notice that's one of the ways to tell it apart from blackberry. And one of the ways to tell it apart from the second-year canes would be to first look, of course, if it has flowers and berries, then you know it's a second-year cane. The other thing you can look at is how happy and vital the leaves are. Your first-year canes are going to be much more happy and vital in their leaves, and they're going to have nice bright green stems, whereas your second-year canes, those stems will have persisted through the winter, and then they're going to turn woody. And you might notice bright green stems growing off of it, but if you look at the main cane stem, it's going to be brown. And so let me show you what that looks like. So here we have a second-year one, and you'll notice that the stem is a darker brown. The leaves look pretty haggard compared to our first-year canes. And you'll, of course, also notice that there are little berries on them, which are really quite tasty. So I'm going to enjoy one of those right now. And so you could use this for other things, but you're not really going to be using this for your leaf medicine, because you can tell just by looking at them that, you know, if you were choosing between one or the other, which one is happier and more vital. And generally, when you're harvesting various plant parts, you're going to harvest when that plant part looks more vital. And it's no question that those first-year canes are more vital. And it would be really easy to tell them apart. So if you're worried that you won't be able to tell them apart because you're a new herbalist, really, it's no worries at all. But also, if you happen to see flowers or berries on it, then you'll know that it's a second-year cane and the leaves aren't going to be quite as good. We're also traditionally going to be using wild raspberry species as opposed to cultivated ones. Not to say that you couldn't ever use a cultivated raspberry, but cultivated raspberries usually don't have quite as much nutrition in their leaves potentially, and they're also really focused on making berries. That's their prime goal in life, whereas our wild ones, you know, fruiting is nice, but it's not their main goal. Their main goal is just to survive and thrive, and so they usually produce more nutritious leaves. They're also often growing in shadier spots, which create a little bit more tenderness to them, and then we can harvest them and make our remedies with them. So to harvest them, I would just kind of go along and pluck off branches kind of like this one here. I'll often dry them on the stem to give them a little bit of airflow, but then once they're dry, I usually will wear gloves for this, because sometimes these hairs, especially as they get dry or older, they can make splinters in your hands pretty easily. So a lot of times I'll wear gloves when I'm harvesting, but I'm especially going to wear gloves once I'm processing the dried material. And so I'll just take scissors or clippers, and once it's dry, I'll just kind of pull off the leaves off of the main stem. And I'll be saving the leaves all dried, and then I'll crunch them up into smaller pieces so that I can store them. Some things for identification as well for the raspberry is that you'll notice that not only does it have those leaves that are in the pinnate shape in the leaflets, and of course it has raspberries if you happen to see the second-year canes, but you also will notice that the underside of the leaf is a lighter white color, and that's one of the things that's relatively indicative of your wild raspberry. So here you can see it's a much lighter color on this side than on this side, so the underside is a lighter white color. So that's raspberry in a nutshell. We do also have blackberries here, and those do get used as medicine. Technically, the leaves have somewhat similar properties, but they're even more astringent than raspberry leaves would be. And we usually are going to use the root of blackberries even more often than we're using the leaves. And the roots are going to be even more astringent than the leaves are. So typically you'll see those being used for diarrhea, dysentery, those kinds of remedies, typically extracted in alcohol like brandy or blackberry brandy, which is kind of fun, and using that when things are just flowing a little bit too much in the lower GI system. But the leaves are generally, of the raspberry leaves, are very safe and can be used on a regular basis to tighten and tone the uterine lining, help when there's bogginess. And this is yet another one of our rose family astringents, or our yarfas, and it's something that can be safely consumed on a regular basis, unlike other stronger tannins like our oaks, which I also have behind me, which would only be used internally in extreme circumstances, super short term, because if you use that high of a level of tannins internally, it can actually be bad for your digestive system, your nutrient absorption, and your kidneys. But the gentle rose family astringents like rose petals and raspberry leaves and lady's mantle are generally safe to consume on a regular basis, especially if you are one of those people who's boggy or leaky and needs a little bit of tightening and toning. And so you can play around with that, enjoy it. They make pretty nice stand-in for green tea as well if you want something that's just sort of gently astringent but has no caffeine. They're chemically very, very different, but flavor-wise, because of their astringent tannins, they have a somewhat similar flavor profile there. So have fun with your raspberry leaves and enjoy. So we have another really cool herb here that's used traditionally for women, although other folks can use it too, and it grows weedy. And so this is actually a compost pile that I never got around to using, and it is now overrun with weeds, but a lot of really good weeds. We've got St. John's wort, we've got jewelweed, we've got goldenrod, we've got burdock, we've got all sorts of good stuff in here. And we also have red clover. And so we're getting sort of towards the end of the season for red clover. It's going to have a few fits and starts, but especially a little bit earlier in the summer, so late June would be a great time to look for red clover, but it also depends on when you planted it and what's going on in the area there. We have some nice red clover here, and it's, you know, kind of coming back. It gets weed whacked periodically and then comes back. The best time to harvest red clover is first thing in the morning or a little bit later in the morning once the dew has dried, but before it's had a chance to get really pollinated by the native pollinators like the bumblebees, because what's going to be the case with that is they're going to be a lot fresher and they're going to dry more nicely without as much browning. However, my teacher Michael Moore would often say the best time to harvest plants is when I'm in front of them, and that's just a really practical approach. So if maybe you have to go to work during the day and so harvesting at 10 a.m. just isn't going to work for you, then by all means feel free to harvest in the afternoon or when it is convenient for you. You're going to look for plant specimens that look quite nice and pretty. This one here has a little bit of browning on it, but it would still be acceptable, and it still has a nice sort of pinky purple color and nice happy green leaves. So it's good enough, and it would be even better if it was a little bit more vivacious, a little bit deeper purple with no browning at all. You definitely wouldn't want one that's really heavily browning, because those ones are not going to be quite as good quality. So let me show you an example of what that looks like. Always be using your senses when you're assessing your plants. So this one here is in pretty good shape still. It's got some nice purple to it. This one here is starting to brown a little, and if you were absolutely desperate and that's all you had, then I suppose you could make do with that, but really you'd be better off going with something that looks more like this. And this one here that's all turning brown, that one is definitely gone by and not one that you'd want to be using as medicine. And so when you are harvesting it for medicine, I like to harvest just the tops of red clover. It's really a conglomerate. This is not one flower. This is many, many flowers all together. And I usually do get whatever little leaves are attached to the top of that flower head as well, but I usually don't bother getting much else that's in there. And then as you go through, what I'll do is I'll harvest the most beautiful ones that day, and then I'll dry them in a dehydrator tray flat. And that's important. One, to dry them flat so that they dry evenly, but also using a dehydrator is particularly important for red clover because they are prone to a variety of different problems if they're not dried properly or if they're not good quality. So of course, if you notice any fungus or weird growths on your plants, you wouldn't want to harvest them. There are some potentially toxic molds and things that can grow on red clovers and other clover species. So don't use them for medicine if they look a little bit cranky. That seems like an obvious thing, but just in case you weren't sure, don't do that. And the other trick to flowers is that they don't always dry very easily towards the middle. So I usually use a dehydrator for drying my flowers, But with red clover, I'm even more apt to do that. And that's because if clovers have a chance to ferment as they're drying, they're going to form coumarins. And coumarins can be a little bit problematic for the liver as well as blood thinning. And if you dry them promptly and thoroughly in a dehydrator, you're going to have very low risk for that. And it's a bigger issue for animals that are grazing on large quantities of this in their hay stock, but it's something we'd want to avoid in people as well. So make sure you do really good quality. And then what do you use them for? Well, you can do fresh extracts too and tincture, but most often we'll dry them and then use them in tea, partly because the flowers just look really pretty in tea and they taste decent. They have sort of a sweet hay-like flavor to them. If you've never just eaten a flower or two off of a head of red clover, go ahead and do it. It's got this nice little pleasant hay sweetness to it. It's got some nice little nectar there. But also, it is rich in various vitamins and minerals. You'll get some calcium, you'll get some magnesium, and you'll also get some phytoestrogens, your plant estrogens, which have a very weak but beneficial effect on the hormone balancing system because they will usually go in and bind preferentially to those receptor sites for estrogen, but they have a much weaker, like less than 1% of the activity of your body's natural estrogen. So they can help bump out stronger and potentially problematic estrogens. So using this on a regular basis, if somebody who is experiencing estrogen dominance, might be helpful because it just helps mellow that out a little bit. But more often you see this used in peri and especially postmenopause because that little tiny bit of plant estrogen can be enough to give just a little bit of a boost to a system that really doesn't have much estrogen floating around at all. And generally speaking, the types of plant estrogens that we get from red clover are usually pretty nice for our body. And if we have good, healthy gut flora or we're taking them with probiotics, we'll usually get even more beneficial effects. So we might use red clover in tea or in other remedies for hot flashes, night sweats, also really classically used for bone strength. It doesn't necessarily encourage the rebuilding of bones as much as maybe some other remedies might. However, it does seem to, if you're consuming it regularly, discourage the body from losing bone as quickly. And then you have all those minerals that are also present in red clover, just kind of conveniently right there, that are going to be supportive for the health and the vitality of the bones as well. So they're a very popular addition to things like nettle and oat straw that are mineral powerhouses in those tea blends, and it'll lighten up the flavor. And as you're making your dried tea, having those beautiful red clover blossoms in there is quite nice. You probably spend a lot of money and a lot of effort if you made your super infusions with only red clover, and that probably is a much higher dose of red clover than necessary. Usually more of like a spoonful or two of red clover in your tea is just about perfect, whereas with oat straw or nettle you could be using whole like cupfuls of it in your quart of tea. But it's a nice herb to play around with. It's also a lymph mover, so it'll help the lymphatic system drain a little bit more effectively to help clear the system from debris of various sorts. So it's a good sort of alternative or general detoxification support herb that way. And it does have a reputation for anti-cancer. I really can't speak to that too much. However, I will say that there have been a few lab studies that have called into question the safety of red clover in somebody who had estrogen-dependent cancers or a risk of estrogen-dependent cancers. And so just based on that, with so limited information available, I probably wouldn't use it regularly in somebody who had a risk for breast cancer or something like that. But you'll hear really differing stories from different herbalists on that. And there are a lot of actions that red clover has that seems like it would actually be beneficial in those cases. But due to those lab studies, which are very limited in nature and may not relate to humans in real life, I just would be a little cautious until we know more for sure. But generally, as long as it's been properly harvested, properly dried, and consumed in modest quantities, it's usually pretty safe for most people, and really nice herb to add to your feminine support teas and your bone strength teas. So have fun with that. So over here we have an herb that is past the stage that we would typically use it for reproductive wellness, but this is Angelica, and traditionally we would use the roots. This is a biennial herb, so it's the second year that it puts up flowers and then it will die. And as with the case with all of your biennial roots, you want to harvest them before they put up their flower stalks. That's usually going to be the fall of the first year or spring of the second year. So at this stage, you can see that it's already gone to flower, it's going to seed. We do have medicinal uses of the seeds, especially as a digestive warming bitter, and we can use the roots somewhat similarly. So there is still a use of Angelica at this stage of her life, but we tend to use it a little bit less often for reproductive value. But the roots harvested of those, first year plants or the early season of the second year plants, those are really, really nice as antispasmodic aids. And we'll usually use that for cramps and bloating, and it is a warming digestive bitter as well, but we'll use them for relatively strong endometrial cramps and other cramps, and it tends to be helpful for that, although endometriosis is really tricky no matter how you go about it. So this is a good plant to know about. It does have your classic umbel shape because this is in the parsley family. So you'll see that you have one stem that goes up, and then it's a compound umbel. That's our parsley family. So it goes up, we get one branch off, and if there was just one flower at the end of the stem, that would just be a simple umbel. But we have a compound umbel, so it does it again. So from that point, it branches out again, and then each one of these little seeds was originally a flower. And they kind of shoot out a little bit like a firework. Not all umbels have this sort of rounded shape about them, but many of them do. And just a really nice plant to know about. Relatively easy to grow in the garden, and if it's happy, it will self-seed, so we'll have to see if this one takes off for future years. But this particular one I planted as a seedling last year in the springtime. And if I had wanted to use it as medicine for the roots, I could have harvested it either in the fall of last year or in the spring of this year. But I actually kind of forgot I had it, but also I do really enjoy seeing it in flower, and maybe it will self-seed. Over here we have one more herb that we tend to use and associate especially with women's health, although it's not specific to women, any gender can use it. And this is an herb that tends to be very specific for relaxing spasms in the uterine lining and throughout the reproductive system, as well as in other systems that have smooth muscle tissue. So you can also use it to ease spasms in places like the digestive system. And while you could give it a try for things like backache, it's not quite as specific in those uses, but sometimes it is helpful. And so this is a plant that is known as cramp bark. And I remember working at a natural food store and having somebody come in and say, "Is there anything I can use for cramps?" And I was like, "Yeah, actually cramp bark works pretty well for a lot of people." And she was like, "Seriously, the plant that I want to use is called cramp bark? Like, how much more obvious could that be?" And yes, it is relatively obvious because it's been used for that for a long time. We use different viburnum species across the country, but cramp bark is one of the most classic ones. We have a couple of different species that are used as cramp bark. We have the trilobum and a few others. This is the trilobum here. And trilobum because the leaves have 3 lobes on them. And this is the one that I personally use. There's another species that's commonly used more down south, and that's black haw, and that's a different viburnum species. And really most of the viburnum species are used somewhat interchangeably. We know from looking at some of the ethnobotanical literature that a lot of the viburnum species were used as antispasmodics in Native American tribes as well. Wherever they were local to a particular viburnum species, they often used that one. So maple leaf viburnum is one that also grows around here that is reportedly also useful for helping with cramps and spasms. So this is a tree or a shrub, and often you'll find it growing wild around here. If you go up north or along the riverbanks, you might see some of the cramp bark. It has pretty cream-colored sort of discs of complex flowers in the spring and summer, late spring, middle spring, and then later in the season, the berries will turn this beautiful kind of fleshy red color, and they're not the tastiest of berries, so a lot of the birds and critters won't really eat them until they have no other choice of what to eat. So these aren't really generally considered edible. It depends on who you talk to, and it depends on the species. One of the other common names for cramp bark is high bush cranberry, because the berries do have a little bit of a cranberry-like quality and flavor, but you'll also see some reports saying that they're moderately toxic, and I don't really have an answer for you one way or the other. I specifically use the bark because it is the bark of this plant that we use, and you can prune it in a couple different ways. Now, normally we wouldn't harvest at this time. It's July right now as I'm shooting this video, and I'm doing it now just to kind of include it with a bunch of other reproductive herbs that are growing right now in the garden. But normally you're going to harvest this in the fall or in the springtime, and it is very vigorous at putting out branches, and so whenever you harvest those, you can go ahead and use them. And there are a couple different ways that you can harvest barks. If you wanted to grow it, more vigorously, you could just kind of cut part way down. And this is called a heading cut, and that's because where you've cut, there's still some stems around it, and it's going to produce more energy to grow even more bushy from there. I actually tend to do more thinning cuts of my cramp bark because it tends to grow pretty bushy anyway, and I like to keep it as sort of a nice looking specimen tree in front of my garden shed. And so a couple times a year I might go through and prune it out, and when I do, I will use those branches as medicine, or I will give them away to my students to use as medicine. And so to do a thinning cut, for that you would go right down to the stem, and let's see if we can pick one that you can kind of see here. So I'll just prune this out and then I will demonstrate off of this one. So if you can imagine that this was growing directly on the tree, if I cut it here or here, that would be the heading cut. You would get more bushy growth out. Now, if I instead went right down to the base and pulled a branch right off the main stem, off the main trunk, you're not going to get as much bushy growth from there. Maybe I wanted to do it here too. And maybe there too. And this one's probably dead, so I'm not going to use that as medicine, but I will prune it off. And so now as we do this, you're not generally going to get more growth off of these stems. You might get a little bit more growth at the top, but nothing here is going to regrow quite the same way as if you chopped it, you know, right above where things were branching off. And so this is a thinning cut, so you can use this to sort of shape your tree a little bit more. If you want to thin it out so that there's more airflow, you could do it that way. We'll often do thinning cuts on fruit trees anyway, so that we promote more airflow, that we get more bigger fruit and get more sunlight in, and the airflow is also going to discourage certain pathogens like molds and things that might take over some of our fruit tree crops. And then as we do that, we can also go ahead and make medicine with those peach barks and crabapple barks and apple barks and things like that. There are all sorts of medicinal uses for those. But if it's something that you wanted to keep growing bushier, like for example, I have a magnolia tree that I use frequently for medicine, and while I do like to shape it with a few thinning cuts, I also don't want it to just keep getting taller and taller and then I can't reach it anymore. And I also want to make sure that I have more branches to harvest each year. And so I make sure to do a handful of the heading cuts periodically, so I do get some bushy growth at my level so I can go back and harvest it later. So depending upon what suits the health of the tree or shrub in front of you, as well as what suits your own purposes and what you'd like to get out of that, that might determine precisely how you prune it. And then once you've pruned it, you can go ahead and remove any leaves if it happens to have leaves at that stage. Normally we'd be doing most of our bark medicine in the spring or the fall when it doesn't really have a lot of leafy growth on it. But if you do happen to get to it in the summer season, just pull those leaves off, use those as your compost or whatever. And then you can take your twigs, I'll just trim that right there. You can take your twigs and just chop those up and use them as medicine whole. You know, just kind of go with my clippers and just over a basket or a bowl or something like that, kind of keep chopping these up and using that as medicine. And then for the larger branches that are maybe like the size of your pinky or so or bigger, those ones I'll take a nice knife or something. I don't happen to have one right here, and I would actually use that to shave off the bark. And I like a nice, you know, a paring knife would work if you can get a hold of a whittling knife. Sometimes you can just kind of like bend them around a little bit or kind of mash them between two rocks. And then once you get it going, sometimes you can actually just peel things off right with your hands, and that's very satisfying. And you can just kind of take things off in nice long strips and use that as medicine. And so we would be using this part here as medicine. The inner woody part is just kind of strength for the tree, so it really doesn't hold a lot of purpose to include in your medicine. It's not that it's harmful, it's just not as potently medicinal. What we really want for most of our bark medicines is the inner bark. And so the inner bark is often kind of a greenish color. It will vary depending on the tree, but green is pretty common. The outer bark is more of this flaky stuff that's on the outside, and that's usually more of a brown color as opposed to the green color. And that's the main protection for the tree. It's usually very high in tannins, which are going to help protect the tree by making it less tasty for critters and also to help protect against pathogens. And while it's okay if a little bit of that gets in the medicine, it's usually not what we're going for with our bark medicine. But the good news is when you're harvesting from smaller branches, you know, up to about yay big, you don't really need to worry about removing that outer bark. If you took down like like a big cherry tree, then you would need to go in and kind of separate the outer bark from the inner bark, and then leave the inner pith and the outer bark behind and just go for that inner bark. But I almost always will work with trees up to about yay big, maybe an inch or so in diameter. And when they're that size, you don't really have to worry about removing the outer bark. You're just going to remove the bark itself and use that outer and inner together. But if you're going to make a tincture with it, those tannins do tend to get really gloppy over time. And so for that, I add about 10% glycerin, and that helps minimize the tannin extraction, and it also helps stabilize the tannins so that they're less apt to bind to other constituents and precipitate out of solution. So that's a nice way to get around it. So if I was making a cramp bark tincture, I could do fresh or dry, but I'd be using those chopped up twigs, and I'd be using these bark strips that I removed from the main stem. And I wouldn't probably bother to use the really bigger stems, and with cramp bark, it's more of a shrubby tree, so usually you don't get a lot of big stems anyway. And then I usually take it as a tincture, but you can also do other remedies with it, and it's really nice as a symptomatic remedy for menstrual cramps and other similar types of cramping. Usually you can take it, and within about 15 minutes or so you'll get relief. If you don't, you can take another dose, and then in another 15 minutes, if you're still not getting relief, you can take another dose. And if it's still not working, it's probably not the right herb for you. It's probably just not going to really work. But it is a little bit relaxing. It does have a little bit of the similar compounds of valerian root, so while it's not particularly sedative, sometimes you will notice a little bit of that skunky aroma that valerian has, and that does contribute to a little bit of a relaxing quality. So that's cramp bark in a nutshell, but relatively easy to grow, and you may even be able to wildcraft it depending upon where you live, if you can positively identify it in the wild and it's abundant enough for you to wildcraft. So enjoy and have fun with that.